That night felt no different at first, busy, fast routine, until she walked in. A black woman, in her early 30s, slightly hunched over, one hand pressed against her abdomen, the other gripping the counter for support, her breathing uneven, her face tense with discomfort. "I need help," she said quietly. The receptionist barely looked up at first, continuing to type before finally glancing over what seems to be the problem. "Severe abdominal pain. It's getting worse." The tone was calm, controlled, but the pain behind it was clear. The receptionist handed her a form. "Fill this out and take a seat. Someone will call you." She nodded slowly, taking the clipboard, her fingers tightening slightly as another wave of pain hit. She sat down carefully, trying to stay composed, but her body betrayed her, shifting uncomfortably, her breathing shallow, her eyes closing for a moment as if focusing on staying upright. Minutes passed, then more. Around her, other patients were being called in, some with visible injuries, others not seeming nearly as distressed but still moving ahead of her. She watched quietly, not complaining, not demanding, just waiting. Another sharp wave of pain hit stronger, this time forcing her to lean forward, gripping the edge of the chair. A nurse passing by noticed her briefly. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Something's wrong," she managed to say. "This isn't normal." The nurse glanced at her chart quickly, then shrugged slightly. "We'll get to you soon, just try to relax." The word felt almost insulting, but she didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. Just nodded again. Time stretched, the pain intensified. Sweat formed along her forehead, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to maintain control. Still no one came. Inside one of the emergency rooms, doctors were dealing with another case, fast-paced, focused, urgent, but not critical. Yet the energy inside felt more serious than the situation demanded. Outside she was still waiting, then suddenly everything shifted. A man rushed into the emergency department, his face tense, his voice urgent. "Where is Dr. Carter?" The room paused for a second. "Dr. Carter isn't here yet," a nurse replied. "Yes, she is. She was called in for emergency surgery. She should be here already. We don't have time." Confusion spread quickly. Phones were checked, schedules reviewed, names called. "No one's seen her," another nurse said. The man ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "We have a patient crashing upstairs. If she's not here in the next few minutes, we're going to lose." Then panic started building. Because Dr. Carter wasn't just any doctor. She was the only specialist available for that procedure that night, and they needed her now, back in the waiting area. The woman slowly lifted her head, hearing the name Dr. Carter. Her expression shifted slightly. She tried to stand, but the pain hit again, forcing her back down. The man rushed past the waiting area, scanning quickly, his eyes landing on her for just a second, then stopping completely. Recognition hit instantly. "Doctor," she looked up, trying to focus. "I've been here," she said quietly. Everything froze. The nurse nearby turned quickly, confusion written all over her face. This is Dr. Carter." Silence, heavy, uncomfortable, because the woman they had ignored, the one they told to wait, the one they dismissed, was the surgeon they had been desperately searching for. The same person who was now barely able to stand. Why wasn't she taken in immediately? The man demanded, his voice rising. No one answered because there was no good answer. Only a series of small decisions, assumptions, delays. Moments that added up, now becoming something much bigger. They rushed to her side immediately, helping her up, supporting her as they moved quickly toward the treatment area. The same urgency that had been missing before, now suddenly present, too late, but still necessary. As they moved her through the hallway, the staff avoided eye contact, a shift in energy, impossible to ignore the difference in how she was treated now compared to just minutes earlier. Inside the emergency room, doctors worked quickly, assessing her condition, realizing the situation was more serious than it appeared. She hadn't just been in pain, she had been in danger. Despite everything, she stayed focused, pushing through the discomfort, asking questions, giving instructions even as they prepared her for both treatment and the surgery she was meant to perform, because someone else's life depended on her and she knew it. Moments later, she was wheeled into the operating room. The same people who had overlooked her now relying on her completely, every movement, every decision critical. The surgery was intense, complicated, requiring precision, focus, and control. Despite her own condition, she performed flawlessly, her training taking over her experience, guiding every step. Hours passed, and finally, the patient stabilized, the life saved. The room exhaled collectively, tension releasing slowly as the realization set in. She had done it. Despite everything. Later, as she recovered in the separate room, the staff moved differently now, quieter, more careful, aware of every word, every action. The nurse who had told her to wait stood outside for a moment before finally stepping in. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It wasn't enough, but it was something." Dr. Carter looked at her calmly, not angry, not emotional, just tired. "You didn't see me as urgent," she said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The nurse lowered her head, unable to respond. Because it was true. Days later, the story spread, not just inside the hospital, but beyond it. Conversations started about bias, about perception, about how quickly pain can be dismissed when it doesn't look the way people expect. Policies were reviewed, training updated, awareness increased, but the moment itself stayed with everyone who witnessed it because it wasn't just about one patient. It was about how easily someone can be overlooked until it's too late, and sometimes the person you ignore is the one holding everything together. The surgery ended, but the silence that followed inside the hospital felt heavier than any emergency that night. It wasn't the usual quiet after a successful operation. It was different, uncomfortable, because everyone in that room knew something had gone wrong long before the surgery even started. Words spread quickly through the hospital, not through announcements but through whispers. Nurses speaking quietly at stations, doctors exchanging looks in hallways, staff replaying the moment in their minds, the waiting room, the delay, the realization Dr. Carter left waiting in pain. Ignored, the same person they later depended on to save a life. By morning, the hospital administration was already involved. Emails sent, meetings scheduled, reports requested, every detail of the night documented step by step, not just the surgery, but everything before it, the timeline, the decisions, the delays. Inside a conference room, senior staff sat around a long table reviewing footage from the emergency department cameras, the screen showing Dr. Carter sitting in the waiting area, hunched over, clearly in distress. The video played in silence. No one spoke, because there was nothing to argue. Everything was visible. The receptionist handing her forms without urgency, the nurse glancing briefly then moving on, other patients being called ahead, minutes turning into nearly an hour. The moment paused and replayed again and again. How did this happen? One administrator finally asked. No one answered immediately because it wasn't one mistake, it was a chain. Small decisions, assumptions, missed signals. Things that seemed minor in the moment but together became something serious. One doctor leaned forward. Her symptoms were clear. Severe abdominal pain should have triggered immediate evaluation. Another added quietly, but it didn't. That was the problem. Not what should have happened, but what actually did. Meanwhile, Dr. Carter remained in recovery, her condition stabilized but still requiring monitoring despite everything. She had pushed through her own medical issue during the surgery, something most people in that hospital would never forget. A senior physician visited her later that day. You shouldn't have been in that position, he said honestly. She looked at him calmly, but I was. That answer stayed with him longer than anything else. Because it wasn't emotional, it was factual. Down in the emergency department, the staff moved differently now, slower, more aware. Every patient interaction carried a new level of attention, questions asked more carefully, symptoms taken more seriously. But it wasn't just procedure, it was perspective. The nurse who had told her to wait found herself replaying that moment repeatedly, every word, every expression, every assumption she made at the time. She sat alone during her break, staring at her hands. I saw her, she whispered to herself. I just didn't see her urgency. And that realization hit harder than any reprimand could. Because it wasn't about intention, it was about perception. And perception can be wrong, very wrong. Later that week, the hospital held a mandatory staff meeting. Attendance required, no exceptions. The room filled quickly, tension noticeable as leadership prepared to address the situation. The chief medical officer stood at the front. What happened here cannot happen again, he said directly. No sugarcoating, no soft language. This is not just about one patient. He paused, letting that settle. This is about how we evaluate pain, how we prioritize care, and how bias, even unintentional, can affect outcomes. The word bias hung in the air. Some shifted in their seats. Others looked down because, whether they admitted it or not, they understood. New protocols were introduced immediately. Triage procedures updated, additional checks required for patients reporting severe pain, regardless of appearance, background, or behavior. Training sessions were scheduled, focusing on recognizing bias in decision-making. Real scenarios discussed openly, uncomfortable conversations encouraged instead of avoided. For the first time, many staff members heard things they hadn't considered before, stories from patients, experiences that didn't match what medical charts showed, moments where pain was minimized or dismissed because it didn't fit expectations, and slowly, understanding grew, not all at once, but enough to matter. Outside the hospital, the story began to spread, not through official statements but through quiet conversations among staff, patients, and eventually local media. Once the details surfaced, the narrative wasn't just about a surgeon performing under pressure. It was about what happened before, the waiting, the dismissal, the delay, and how close it came to something worse. Public reaction was strong, people sharing their own experiences, stories that sounded similar, different hospitals, different situations, but the same underlying issue. Not being believed, not being prioritized, not being seen. The hospital released a statement acknowledging the incident, outlining the steps being taken, emphasizing accountability and improvement. But for many, the real impact wasn't in the statement, it was in the awareness. Back inside, Dr. Carter returned to work weeks later, not seeking attention, not addressing the media, just stepping back into her role quietly. The same professionalism, the same focus, the same calm presence, but the environment around her had changed. Staff greeted her differently, conversations more careful, interactions more respectful, not out of fear but out of recognition. One afternoon, the same nurse approached her again. This time more steady. I've been thinking about that night, she said. Dr. Carter looked at her waiting. I made a judgment too quickly, the nurse continued, and I didn't question it. She paused. I'm trying to change that. Dr. Carter nodded slightly. That's where it starts, she said. Not forgiveness, not blame, just acknowledgement. And movement forward. Months passed, and the changes became part of the hospital's daily routine, no longer something new but something expected. Patient evaluations improved, response times adjusted, complaints decreased slowly but noticeably. The impact wasn't perfect, but it was real. And sometimes, real change doesn't come from perfection. It comes from moments that force people to see what they missed before. One evening, Dr. Carter walked through the emergency department again, passing the waiting area where it had all started. For a moment, she paused, looking at the chairs, the desk, the same space, but a different atmosphere. A nurse quickly approached a patient, asking questions, listening carefully, taking notes with urgency, no delay, no hesitation, just action. Dr. Carter watched briefly, then continued walking, because that was the goal, not to relive the moment, but to change what comes after it. And somewhere in that hospital, in every decision made a little more carefully, every patient taken a little more seriously, that night still existed, not as a mistake alone, but as a turning point, a reminder that pain should never have to prove itself, and the person you overlook might be the one holding everything together.